SMB Wisdom acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands upon which we have recorded this podcast today. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
Hello and welcome to the SMB Wisdom podcast, coming to you from the land of the Yuggera and Turrbal people. My name is Alice Ruhe and I'm a partner at SMB Advisory, the proud sponsors of this podcast. The SMB Wisdom podcast is a forum to provide valued tips for business owners from an extended network of experts on their topics of expertise. I'm so very blessed to have an amazing network of people who are fabulous at what they do. They might be accountants, lawyers, business owners, or any number of individuals that day in, day out deal with the issues and problems that can plague small and medium business owners and come up with solutions, outcomes, and results to assist. It's now my mission to bring some of this knowledge to small and medium business owners to assist them in making their good businesses great and their great businesses fabulous. Now on with today's episode. Well, hello everyone and welcome to this special episode of the SMB Wisdom podcast. I'm coming to you today a little bit out of the ordinary, a little bit sort of after the event and a little bit ad hoc. Radhika Kanhai from Moray and Agnew, friend of the podcast on here regularly, is joining me to have a quick chat about some views that we have been sharing with each other around International Women's Day. I know we're, a week, 10 days-ish after the event, but there was a cyclone and some other stuff that happened, so we didn't think that there was an issue with putting this together at this time. Welcome, Radhika, to the podcast.
Thank you, Alice. Thanks for having me again. I always enjoy being on this show and chatting to you.
Thank you. Now, I think everybody who listens to this podcast regularly and who knows either Radhika or myself know that we have worked together. We've been colleagues, but also on committees and these sorts of things for quite some time together. And we have been part of organisations that have quite a female focus on those organisations. And I think, Radhika, you and I worked really hard sort of in earlier days to try and look at more advocacy. And we're talking sort of almost 15 years ago now, I think, sort of advocacy and more of a focus around sort of the presence of women in the industries that we work in. And I guess I thought we'd have a quick chat about sort of how International Women's Day has changed, I guess, a little bit between when we sort of started and we're really promoting different sort of functions and lunches and these sorts of things to where we maybe feel about it now. Have you had some sort of thoughts about that?
Yes, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of International Women's Day events throughout the month of March, or, people are getting in earlier and at least having 2 weeks or so of holding these functions. I do think that we're seeing a lot more of them, which is great. I think also that some people I've heard or know that have been boycotting these events because of attendance fatigue, and I think, combined with despair about lack of progress. And I must say I've been ambivalent myself about attending events, but I've reflected about, the nature of International Women's Day and why it exists. And I decided that I will attend because I wanted to celebrate the women that were either speaking or colleagues of mine or friends or acquaintances, business contacts that I was going with or had been invited by, while, of course, still being able to advocate for the changes that need to come. So I don't think we necessarily need to boycott if, what we're fighting for isn't quite there. I think you can still celebrate the achievements and the people at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And yeah, full disclosure, one of those events was one I invited you to. So I agree. And probably come from that, from a very similar aspect. I've got to admit this year, my decisions on a lot of these matters were made for me because of the cyclone that was there. But I did, I was planning on participating in a few bits and pieces because, again, for me, it's really about the celebration of what we are and the recognition of what things were like not that long ago. And I think it's really important, as women to understand that whilst we still have quite a way to go, and I firmly believe that, and we'll talk about that in a minute, we've also come quite some way, and I don't think that should be discounted. I look at my daughter and sort of look at her sort of looking at the world thinking, well, it's always been like this. I don't know anything different. And that will change for her as she progresses through her life and sees, what there is that might be different for her. But, I think about things like my mother who had to actually resign when she got engaged. Now, that was my mother. So that's not that long ago, and just the differences in terms of women's rights over a very short period. I'm listening to a podcast at the moment about, Emmeline Pankhurst and what things were like, when women weren't actually able to vote. And that wasn't that long ago. So I think a celebration of where we're at and remembering what has happened and what sort of, what things were like, because I think, people talk about the slippery slope. Things can go back. It's not that far, when you think about it. But I think we do still have a long way to go. And I think sort of what is meant by or what maybe people feel around International Women's Day has changed. It definitely has for me in those aspects. I guess for me, advocating for women's rights or equality overall is really not a one-day thing. So, whilst it's celebrated, absolutely, it's not something where sort of that's the only day we need to wear our purple and roll out all of our women.
No, and I think, that's, I suppose, the fear of some people that it's, why, if you celebrate International Women's Day, it's only one day or 1 week or a couple of weeks, and then these issues are forgotten about. But I think by having those events, you're actually reminding people that it is something that needs to be constantly worked on. In the absence of those events, I think people wouldn't bring these issues or have the opportunity to bring these issues to the fore. So, of course, the statistics are damning in terms of progress in relation to pay parity, women on ASX listed boards, women in leadership and equity positions. But I think in the absence of having conversations about this, and it shouldn't only be on an annual basis, but, we're chatting, I think, by having these conversations, a few weeks after, by constantly being cognizant of it in everything we do. Unconscious bias issues, hopefully, dissipate because it is at the people's forefront of people's minds. I mean, one thing that I saw somewhere, one phrase that really resonated for me was the change is showing up every day in ways that matter. The change is showing up every day in ways that matter. So I think that's a really great mantra in terms of advocating for change for women.
Absolutely.
Is basically saying, okay, what am I going to do to change views or change the way discriminatory practices are being implemented, or change, the way conversations are being had in a way that actually advocates for women.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think, not just for women. Like, I think that's the other thing as well. We sort of can see International Women's Day at times. And look, I'm listening to a podcast at the moment around Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragette movement. And even as far back as that, there were criticisms mostly around class as opposed to cultural or other sort of ability-based differences. But it was around, how the suffragette movement was very much focused on the middle class white woman. And that's sort of who they were advocating for. And, that it was all very well and good to seek rights there. But then, there is a broader community that weren't basically just middle-aged white men. So realistically, that was there was that one party that was everything at the time, the middle-aged white men. But, and you can only, you get so much fatigue at the best of times, sort of advocating for maybe your section or, section is adjacent to you in society. But I think we need to also realise that sort of equity and equality is not just, doesn't just have one perspective. And I think sometimes there is a little bit of deafness around that.
I think so. I must say there was mixed panel makeup in some of the events I went to. It is disappointing when I go to a panel event, and it doesn't only relate to International Women's Day, but I don't see any people of colour or women of colour, because as a woman of colour myself, I think, there's representation in that diversity is really important because, as you said, International Women's Day or women's issues shouldn't just be about the dominant white perspective. And as the years have been going by, I'm being very alive to the fact that women of colour are very underrepresented in these types of conversations. And there's often, diverse cultural elements and views in relation to the representation of women in all sorts of industries and facets of life. So, one thing I've been really conscious of is, being you can't be what you can't see, and being really alive to that concept of being a role model, being able to advocate for people who won't, or women of colour who necessarily are not brought to the fore, and sort of, lights not shone on them in terms of great things they're doing, but also some of the disadvantages that comes with being a woman of colour. And I think sometimes International Women's Day events and conversations forget about that, or don't. They think, women's issues are all seen through this lens of a dominant white societal theory, which, as you've highlighted, your podcast with Emily Pankhurst was very much of that time. And so I think, living in a multicultural society, these types of issues where we're looking at diversity, not just in relation to gender, but also cultural, and, the intersection between women, culture, and International Women's Day. I'd like to see more of those conversations happening.
Of course. Yeah. And that makes sense as our sort of, you keep looking at who the actual sort of representation is supposed to be representing. That's the thing I often come back to, and in so many different instances, whether it's politics, whether it's business, whether it's, presenting whatever it is. It's like, I think you sort of have to understand who's supposed to be represented and who's doing the representing. And sometimes the reconciliation between those two things, as an accountant, I like to reconcile, but as the reconciliation between those two things doesn't always check out. And I find that quite interesting from time to time.
Yeah, And I think, it's International Women's Day. It should be a celebration of women
Mm,
of all um, forms. And
mm,
I sometimes think it's just forgotten because people think, oh, well, diversity is women, not diversity being,
mm,
women of all different
mm-hmm.
um, backgrounds. And so, yes, I think
Mm,
hopefully we can see more involvement with the conversations going forward in this
mm.
space.
No, absolutely. And I think going back to, I really like your "you can't be what you can't see." I often refer to that as well. I think it's really relevant. I think sometimes I
Mm.
sort of try to be a lot of places, and you sort of think, I don't think people need to see me that much. But I really do believe that you need to be um, sort of, to be seen so that you can show a representation. I mean, and I'm, that's a one of,
Mhm.
many, and that's fine. But I think it's the showing up as part of that,
Mm.
continuing to do that. And it's funny, my son plays footy, and he loves the big glory, scoring the try and doing all of the glory things. And I say to him, that's fine, but what you actually need to do for your team to get to that point is just be consistent. Be the safe set of hands that takes the ball, take the tackle, go in and help your teammates. And if you just do those really simple things and do them consistently, then that's going to lead to these bigger things happening
Mm.
at the end of the day. And I think similarly, where we sort of sit, you can have massive grand gestures, and you can do, organizations can attempt to put on certain, not necessarily functions, but maybe put white papers or whatever it is, forward on this day or at this time, and do these grand gestures. But in April, May, or June, is anyone actually looking at what the scorecard looks like? And I think for mine, and the real focus that I'm seeing at the moment, is just about keeping showing up, keep standing up, and then keep sticking up as well. And I think it's funny, the sort of show up so that people can see that this is normal, this is who
Mm.
we are, these are the positions we have, and absolutely that's great. And I myself look to other women in different organisations and in different positions myself, to be able to take some sort of motivation from that when looking at, different roles or committee positions or board positions and that sort of thing. I think we need to keep standing up for what we believe in, and
Mm.
standing up for things that matter. I'm a big advocate of what you walk past is what you accept, and that can be very tiring from time to
Mm.
time. I think that's really important to keep doing that and being sort of the
Yes.
annoying mosquito in the room, but also sticking up. And I think sticking up is one of those things for me. It sort of reminds me a little bit of being in the schoolyard, but it's like sticking up for others that may not be, you know, may not have the same experiences as you, or may not be,
Mm.
in the same from the same background as you, or may have different viewpoints from you potentially. As long as
Mm.
they're, but sticking up for the rights of everybody. Quite
Mm.
frankly, in
Mm.
terms of looking at that, is who is being
Mm.
represented
Yeah.
by the right subset of people. And I know that sort of sounds a little bit all over the shop because it's sort of still formed, but I'm starting to really, I think, strengthen in my belief that that's where it sort of all
Mm.
comes together.
Yeah, and I really like that show up, stand up, and stick up concept. And in that sticking up, I think the male leaders that are contributing to change, male colleagues, the males in our lives,
Mm.
that's just a really important aspect, sticking up, supporting the women, supporting policies that advocate and promote women.
Yeah,
Um, and, I'm focusing, of course, on women here, but this applies generally to
absolutely.
many underrepresented and underprivileged in our communities. And that's just a important part. And I have been seeing more and more of that being advocated. I think on LinkedIn I saw lots of messages from men that I admire, some I know well and some I don't, where they were putting posts, advocating for women, and actually putting themselves out there. Because maybe even last year or the last 5 years, I didn't see that sort of reaction. And yes, it was done around International Women's Day, and yes, some cynics might say it was quite performative, but I think the authenticity is obviously something that can't necessarily come across on a LinkedIn post. But if these men actually live and breathe and practice what they preach in their everyday lives, then I think there is hope in our workplaces, in our society moving forward. And I think that then highlights the importance of having International Women's Day and these celebrations, and something that people are then drawn to really push for and advocate. It sort of all ties in, right? You can't
absolutely,
conversations without having the visibility and the around International Women's Day.
Oh, look, entirely. And I think it's really important. Like, there's that whole thing about, know who will stick up for you in a room when you're not there. And I think that, again, is really important. And I don't think, well, I definitely don't discount the role that strong male sponsors have had in my career and in my life. Like, you look at what my husband does, and, there's no way I could do what I do in the way that I do it and have what I have in the way that I have it if we didn't have the relationship that we do. And I'm very blessed with that. But similarly, I've worked for some very strong, very strong and very smart, but very supportive men who have always sort of looked at what I do, and I think have stood up for me at times when many others hadn't. And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to be a product of some of that. I mean, you've got to work bloody hard to get where you are too, but, then you've got to be able to get the next step. And if you don't have people to support you to do that, then that's very hard. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that sticking up part, whether it's people sticking up for you in the rooms that you're not in, or you doing it for others in the rooms that you're in that maybe they're not. And again, I think the more I sort of grow and the more my perspectives grow, it's that whole equality thing. Like, I find it, I struggle a little bit with just as a singular gender campaign. And whilst I am the first to stand up for women's rights and I'm the first to advocate, it doesn't take very much to see that. I think we also need to look at it within the greater construct.
Yes. No, I agree. And I think, in my career, like yours, I have been supported by some strong male role models and sponsors. And I think, that was probably at a time that there weren't many women role models and leaders. So I'm hopeful, as generations come through, people in our positions in leadership roles will be able to then bring up other women behind them, and be that supportive, strong sponsor and role model. I think, and going back to the phrase that I mentioned, the change is showing up every day in ways that matter. Being that advocate, being someone that supports generations below, um, I think there is a lot that can be said for that as we progress.
Absolutely. So, unless you've got anything else to add, I guess I'd like to sort of have a chat about, well, where to from here? What do we see future? I want to say International Women's Day, but I feel like I should just say marches, as in the month of March, because then in most of February. But in the years to come, how do you see International Women's Day sort of playing out? Do you think, because there obviously is a undertow of a certain level of fatigue, but there's also the celebration aspects. I mean, I've got my thoughts, but what do you think?
I think, well, the phrases this year, or the slogans for International Women's Day was accelerate action and marching forward. So I think in terms of the future, I think, there's obviously the repeat of where we're at, and the statistics hopefully will improve. I think in a lot of aspects they have, but there is still the pay parity issues. There's still domestic violence issues. There's still not enough funding in relation to women's health issues. There's a lot and a lot and a lot, and I don't have all the statistics to hand, but I think we've all read about them and heard about them, particularly in the last couple of weeks. And I think, in and of itself, that's actually really important, to really be alive and always conscious of that. So I think, I'm a glass half full person, because I'm quite optimistic that through all these incremental changes that we can do grassroots level in our communities with our work colleagues, being leaders ourselves, being of a generation that we can hopefully influence change for the generations below us. I'm really positive. I see every day the support of the women in my life, be that personally in my friendship circles or with my work colleagues. And I think that is such an important part of celebrating, yet advocating for change. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive.
No.
So,
that's right.
yeah, I think there is, I'm always hopeful that more can be done, but I genuinely think that, showing support, showing support in actual practical ways, in either it be implementation of policies or advocating for, females in your lives, advocating for positive change. We can all do our bit, so the future is hopeful.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I think it's always good to have an anchor point to check in on things. And I think that International Women's Day does allow us to do that. So I do think that it is a point at which we can check in on these sorts of statistics, and make sure that we can understand and measure where things have come from and where they're going. Maybe it's about not always just being quite a cosmetic type of day, but a relevant day. And I think it's one where we remember where we've come from. But I think we also look to but to sort of have some aspirations about where we go. And it's always good, as I said, to have those. I think you need those times where you're sort of purposefully checking in. We all have the end of the financial year, or we all have, when we all sit down to New Year's resolutions, where you're like, I think you need an anchor point at least every 12 months, sometimes more, but to actually say, hey, we actually didn't do that well this year. or, hey, these are the targets and this is how we measured against them. Not too bad, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think when you stop measuring and you stop checking in, that's where the apathy can come in. And I think that's very dangerous. And so I think it's important that we have these anchor points that we can do that. And I do see International Women's Day as one of those. So long as it's not done, with a sugar coating and these sorts of things. So I think it's very much an ongoing, showing up, standing up, sticking up, doing the hard yards, holding people accountable, and just moving through life with that level of authenticity that you were talking about, in terms of equality. And then having that sort of time of year, that March, that International Women's Day, to really say, okay, where have we come? Let's celebrate the great things that have happened and be a little bit scared about the fact that, not too long ago, things weren't as good as they are now. Celebrate the amazing women in our lives, but not by rolling them all out and here's some cupcakes and, making it a very trivial thing. I think it has the capacity to be, and I think in some corners it is, a very sort of quite a strong, monumental day of acknowledgement and checking in, and seeing what we can then do to focus on moving forward. But there are lots of other days and lots of other things in the world of diversity and in the world of equality that do need to be accounted for as well.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Having these anchor points, really important, is a reference to check in. And in terms of, actual action that can be taken, I think moving forward, couple of things that I've thought I'd do is, call out bad behavior in terms of women and lack of advocacy of women. So if there's, negative remarks or, something less overt, like, just if there's particular discussion on, a policy that's being implemented, but there's, some remarks made about that, or if there's not, a lot of buy-in, or, just if there's some actions or conduct being taken that's either covert or overt, and you sense that, it needs to be called out, then call it out. Of course, it needs to be assessed in the context, and perhaps, there's other ways of calling out bad behavior rather than having a conversation that's not going anywhere, but perhaps in a more diplomatic or sensitive way can be called out, but calling out that behavior. And then, having meaningful discussions, perhaps about why that behavior or conduct or assessment of an issue wasn't done in a way that is conducive to advocating for women. And, having those conversations more regularly, not only when bad behavior needs to be called out, but
just on an ongoing basis.
Too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than, having it just a International Women's Day, let's talk about these issues, being performative, but actually having those discussions and having it, top of mind in your daily interactions.
I think with that, I couldn't agree more. And I think sometimes, I've got to be careful what I say, but you sort of don't want to be seen as the angry woman in the room by calling out things. And I can sometimes come across as that, and I'm very happy to be described. But I think there's ways and means to do that, which I'm learning in terms of in a more subtle but effective way. And I'm finding that just asking people to clarify what they meant by something is a really good way of starting that, because if you're coming at from a position of trying to understand whether there is some sort of miscommunication, and you constantly seek to question that,
I think the
then
very fact of asking them to clarify probably makes them think about what it is that they've said.
correct, and also whether they're going to say it again, because
Yeah.
if they're sort of feeling though that they are going to be held to account, like there can't just be a little snide remark, or there can't just be some sort of underlying, there's sort of microaggressions. There's some really good work that's being done about microaggressions in the workplace.
And I think some people genuinely might not feel like what they've said is inappropriate or, not of a nature that is supportive of women. It just might be requiring of an education piece. Particularly, I think we've all kind of encountered people who are unaware that because of the conditioning throughout their lives of behaving a certain way or thinking certain things are acceptable. So, it's not about poking a finger and saying, that you're a nasty person, or it's more just, when I say calling out, it's not in a vicious or vindictive way. It's more just, I suppose, being alive to what's been said, not being okay.
Yeah.
And then having a conversation about it as to why that's not okay, or what can be done to, address that particular issue.
And whether things can be done differently in future, potentially. But I think that all comes back right to that, showing up, standing up and sticking up. And I know it can be tiring from time to time, but I do think it's important. And I do think that sort of, the contributions that we can continue to make. Radhika, did you have any final words you wanted to offer before we wrap up?
No, I just wanted to I think we've covered a lot of ground there. So thank you everyone for listening. But I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity to chat about some of the things we often chat about, particularly leading up to this International Women's Day, and some of the fatigue I think you and I were both feeling, but then, going away and reflecting on why it is that we do what we do and the meaning of International Women's Day. So thanks for the opportunity, Alice.
No, thank you so much, Radhika. It's always lovely to chat with you, but also in this format where we can record and have that as well. Look, the SMB Wisdom podcast has always been a forum for people to sort of almost be a fly on the wall, where people talk about different matters to gain perspective or to gain wisdom in those areas. And whilst that's generally from a very sort of commercial or technical way, which I think is incredibly important, the way we run our businesses, I think it's also important, when we have a chat, sometimes I just think you should, hit record, and it probably could be quite valuable to some people out there. Maybe not, maybe not all, but it's, might be valuable to some. And so I do really appreciate you coming and being really candid with me and putting some of these views out there as well. Thank you everyone for listening. This is probably going to kick off now our next season of SMB Wisdom, and we've got some really amazing technical episodes coming up. So keep an eye on your feed, keep an eye on all of our socials, and be wise in business. Thanks, Radhika.
Thanks, Alice.
SMB Wisdom is proudly sponsored by SMB Advisory. SMB Advisory is a specialist firm of chartered accountants dedicated to providing specialist insolvency services to financiers, advisors, directors, and individuals. The team at SMB Advisory are a safe set of hands to talk through your options when things get tough, or when you find yourself in a tricky business situation and you're not sure what's next. Call the team on 1-800-762-238 or send a message through the website www.smbadvisory.com.au to talk through the next steps in your business journey.